rich text. I think we need to give it more justice than we probably did. And I think it's important to look at both the episodic and the dialectical method at work. He really works like in an episodic fashion in many ways. And there's a kind of interesting approach here that is very dialectical. And this whole notion of the habits and how the changing of the habits is crucial for the political aesthetics that Benjamin is trying to found. This is an attempt in my book of an attempt towards a very creative Marxist political aesthetics, right? Not the political aestheticization or just politics and art, but a kind of an attempt to begin a study of what is political aesthetics. And, a lot of his examples are really a way of trying to show how the Nazi, or the fascist moment, right? And of course, Mussolini's even more important in this regard earlier on, how they're very good to take up old traditional aesthetic concepts. And one of the attacks on the aura is probably to keep the aura out of the hands, right? These notions of beauty or the aestheticization of beauty that is used by fascist art. So I think this is a very complicated essay on this basis. He's trying to take away some traditional categories in almost like a real destruction of the notions of beauty and other things in art that we have held very sacred, if you will. So in some ways, he's definitely wants to render, if you will, these notions almost useless for fascism. And this is one of the reasons for, I think, the consistent attack, if you will, or the consistent, linguistic war machine against the aura throughout, right? So there's something very, very important here. I think also the use from Eitgetz, and Sean knows something about this, that the people, right? That Eitgetz in some ways, opens up space in photography in a way, removes people and destroys really, a kind of, people-oriented photograph, portraiture, all these things that could be used in the cult of the leader or the cult value, if we want to look at these things in terms of their dialectical interplay. So I think these are very important notions too. Also the cult of the movie star, the celebrity, and then also what he's looking at is a kind of other cult value, that of the audience. And we have this tremendously today. The followers on Twitter, the platform, all of these things are very much of what Benjamin really understands very early on in this 1935-36 essay. How does this cult of the audience and how available this is to fascistic, if you will, appropriation, right, in many ways. And, make no mistake, the right wing, even in this country, have a background in classics, some of them. And we know certainly with the Straussian moment at the University of Chicago, which had a lot to do with, the retaking of the conservative party, the neocons, had a lot of background in the Greek and Latin classics. So this was very important to keep in mind here, what the stake is. And I want to emphasize Thesis 9 of the Philosophy of History, which is in Illuminations, which I have here. This is really where Benjamin's coming from. The clay painting, right? In Thesis 9, but also I want to just say too that let me just go back. So Thesis 9, the clay painting Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something that he's fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. When we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, would like to awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in the wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. So Benjamin, like Adorno and the rest of yeah. Is there a reason for the noise, or is it just me? Is that in the recording, or?
I don't know if it's someone's phone or not, but I can.
Okay. All right, no problem. Okay. So again, this is very important, this idea of progress, that the Frankfurt School really had no attempt to say this is real out of the Enlightenment. This is really the dialectic of enlightenment at work in this thesis here. I had one other thing I wanted to mention too, that Benjamin, his whole project in some ways is, again, to give voice to what we call the subaltern. I think it's also very important to remember that Benjamin is always thinking about hope that we have is for those without hope. I think this is very, very important to remember, in terms of Walter Benjamin's work. I'm trying to see, I wrote down one quote that I found somewhere else that was very appropriate for this moment, but anyway, I'll find it in a second. So anyway, I'd like to hear, I guess, from you anything. I mean, for me to reread this is very important, because he really understands, I think, what it means to dialectically reason, right? He really understands this in so many ways. And yeah, so, of course, the protest against money that I read too, and of course the question of what role do the masses really play in this age of technical reproduction, and why does he choose who he chooses? You notice he doesn't really go into specific films, except the one that Douglas mentioned was Abel Gance's Napoleon. Yeah, that's the only director he really goes into any detail about, right? Even though you can see the affection for Chaplin, a little bit for Disney, right? And of course, as you know, the Frankfurt School liked the Marx Brothers very much. Yeah, so that's another element, right? That is crucial. So yeah, let me hear from you. The question of the historian, is always to brush history against the grain, to give voice to the voiceless, and to give hope to the hopeless, right, in many ways. So this is very, very important, this notion of redemption, or what the Germans call Sollen phenomena, saving the phenomena. And it seems to me Benjamin in terms of this Jetztzeis and the notion of messianic time really wants to go there. This is what he is. And art, in the hands of the masses. And if you notice, this is an optical, right, and a tactile moment that's going on in this, and the analogies he draws between the sorcerer and the magician, the filmmaker and the painter, right, which is interesting. And Richard's here tonight because he talks about the filmmaker as being more on the level of the sorcerer, right? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about him and this whole notion of messianic time. And because here the temporality is to create a world in which there is not a reduplication of the aura, because that can be taken up by the fascistic political aestheticization. At the same time, what does the new work of art look like, or what is this criteria that he's trying to develop? So I think this is a good kind of starting point to go back to Benjamin, and then we'll go on to Stiegler in a little while. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you, Michael, and maybe other people would know more about Benjamin
Sure.
too, is that his sort of rejection of the idea of progress you know, I was actually looking at the Stiegler, the other Stiegler text this week, the Sociopathology of 1968.
Right.
And in the beginning of that, he also sort of links the idea of progress and modernity, you know, with this concept of rationalization that seemed like in some ways connected to the way Heidegger is thinking about it, or in that other those other essays on technology. And so, you know, that to me like had some resonance ultimately, just between thinking about the way that, you know, Benjamin sort of rejects progress, and then you know the way Stiegler sort of approaches it in that text too. I mean, it's very interesting. I thought we were supposed to read that one too, so I sort of read a large portion of that one again.
I'm glad you did. Yeah, I was going to read
it very nicely, yeah, to
yes,
what we were doing previously.
Yeah.
But I don't
I
know.
don't want to overload you guys at once, but yeah, I mean, I'm like the dialists, you know, with the projectile. But yes, no, it's a good point. I mean, Stiegler certainly follows out of this tradition where the dialectic of enlightenment, that progress is thrown pretty much into question, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so this has been, you know, and Adorno's essay on progress, the idea of progress, is crucial here too. But certainly for Heidegger, for Nietzsche, for obviously, you know, in some ways Freud, yes, of course, you know, in the terms of that pessimism in history, you know, and most of the Frankfurt School, and certainly Bernard Stiegler, are not really thinking through the dominant notion of progress, right? And to get out of that circle too is another thing. And this is one of the reasons that they're politically far advanced than what we have today, the Jacobin crowd, the AOCs, the, you know, the social democrats in Germany, of course, right, in a sense. And I guess everybody knows the first to use the language of cultural revolution was Lenin. Yeah, he was the first to use that, well before, you know, 1940, 1960s and the Red Guards, right? This was a very important element. And we'll get to this with Stiegler. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Josh. I mean, there, you know, the question is that really a kind of progress and this myth of progress? Yeah, it's being thrown into question. I mean, I'd like to hear other people. What do you think of this? Because this is a value, if you will, right? And a notion of time, progressive time, chronological time, which seems to me to be always at stake in these discussions. Heidegger. You know, certainly Benjamin, certainly Adorno in a different way, and of course, you know, Nietzsche, and in his way. And then, of course, you can think about Marx. There's the late Marx versus the humanistic Marx, the way Althusser reads Marx in terms of Marx of the break or the rupture, if you will, or the epistemological break. Is Marx, you know, breaking with this humanistic approach to progress? You know, obviously the manifesto is full of progress, right? I mean, you know, if you read the manifesto of the party carefully, but if you read it only as a manifesto of a party formation, it may take on a different light, right? That it is an attempt in some ways to mobilize, whereas Benjamin may be doing the same thing in terms of this work. Yeah, the attempt to mobilize, you know, let's put the hand and the eye together in the hands of the masses, right? Back to the hands of the masses, right? Without this notion of aura, which the fascists were so good at taking up. Yeah. So yeah, some other people. I mean, again, I think this is a very crucial way of entering into, because everybody we read here in this course, if you will, is not thinking through progress the way we normally think about it. It's not progressive time. Yeah. So.
Yeah, Michael, I'm particularly curious to unpack a little bit the sections 8, 9, and 10, where he ends on the notion of the celebrity cult, and he talks through the shift from stage to film acting, and then like in 10. The reason I want to unpack it is because like I kind of want to take where he lands in 10 and connect that, like not connect it immediately, but try to see social media and the experience of the self sort of politically through social media via like how he's describing the way the cult of the celebrity develops as
Right.
like an actor in front of a camera, always like immediately conscious of a public that will see the image that, you know, he doesn't have control over or whatever. And
Right.
like what happens when that experience is sort of universalized in the way that social media universalizes that experience. And so this transition that he goes through in 8, 9, and 10 that lands on the cult of the celebrity and almost implies, I mean, he can't see it exactly, but he implies kind of like it's expansion, you know, and what we kind of experience as the universalization of the cult of the celebrity as he describes it, sort of growing from the experience of the film actor, I think is really interesting. I don't know Pirandello at all, and so I can't really.
Yeah, from Pirandello through the film actor to what we could call the era of the selfie, right? And the era of the platform, right? In some ways, we could rewrite this. You know, what is this work of art in the era of the you know, celebrity culture called the selfie, right?
Exactly.
That everybody can take a selfie. What is the role of the photographic image? What is its relationship to temporality? Of course, what does the photograph do? Versus that to the cinematic time, of which, you know, Stiegler will talk of. One of the reasons to look at this, because I think Stiegler, you know, in terms of the cinematic time, is taking up maybe a little bit of what, you know, Benjamin hints at that he does not develop, right? You know, and of course, you know, we're going to have good discussions on that because Stiegler has his group of, you know, thinkers. You know, he'll speak of Husserl, which Benjamin mentions nothing of intentionality and protensional, retensional objects and temporality in that regard, right? And of course, he'll talk about Heidegger too, right? And in a sense, and vis-a-vis the cinematic image. So, I mean, you raise really good questions here. I mean, I would call it the cult of the celebrity to the cult of the audience and that dialectical interplay, because the audience itself becomes the cult. How are my Twitter followers going to take to this? You know, and one study of this could be on the right wing of how good Trump was at this cult of the celebrity to the cult of the audience, right? You know, enough to build up, you know, enough ammunition to have a raid on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of this year. You know, we're you know, about 11 and a half months past. So I don't know.
It strikes me too, Michael, just right there, that like something about the effectiveness of Trump with his audience and the way that the line is blurred between playing a character and playing oneself, that I think Benjamin also like points to here, and the way that Trump like very, I don't know how consciously, I'm not in his head, but very effectively blurs that line and has for years blurred the line between like reality, right? Between who he is, the character he plays, and whether that character is a representation of who he really is or a persona that he's developed. And the purposefulness with which he blurs that line is also, I think, part of like his effectiveness in this with his audience. Right.
I think both also throw into question what we were doing with Heidegger in this age of the world picture and the whole question of representation that is being, you know, taken down and where we are today, as well as, of course, later in Heidegger, the Gestalt, the enframing, you know, how we become stuck in this enframing in so many ways, constantly, right? Yeah, you can almost predict what the latest thing is going to be on the Omicron variant, right? I mean, I know we can't predict where it's going to go. We hope for the best, of course, but at the same time, we know how the media is going to work with this. We know the codes, right? Yeah, Richard, you want to say something, or Douglas?
Yeah, I'm just going to say about Trump and the cult of the audience and cult of personality. You know, there was, I think Lacan says somewhere that, you know, the way that you know, there's an expression in French, crazy like Napoleon, fou comme Napoleon. And the way you can tell that Napoleon wasn't crazy is because he didn't think he was Napoleon. In other words, between the symbolic role, you know, that one has to fill a symbolic role, and there's always a bit of feeling of an imposter. You know, there's always some separation. And So in a funny way, you know, it's not the playing a role that would be unusual, but to actually believe, to identify with the role, which is, you know, to really believe you're Napoleon, to really believe you're Donald Trump in a way. It's, you know, in terms of identity, also the whole thing about identity today is that these are given a kind of reality, or there's a level of belief in identities, you know, and an accompanying sense of fury and anger and you know, and not having one's identity recognized, that I think is, you know, very, very striking. So, I mean, just another way to go at it would be not the playing of the role, but the actual belief that you're not playing the role, that you actually fully identify yourself with this this role.
You know, there's so, I mean, since we're going to be talking about cinematic time and we're actually talking about the celebrity, you know, if you know Ingmar Bergman's work about the psychiatrist who breaks down, I don't know, because of the role, the misplaced identities, right? The actor then that becomes actually, Bergman always has this fascination, and as most of you probably know, Bergman suffered for many, many breakdowns. You know, the way he would come back to reality in terms of his reconstruction was to pick up a camera and just start filming very primitive things, you know, so this tactility and the optical unconscious were very active, you know, at once, you know, so this is interesting too. I think Scenes from a Marriage was one of the thing, and I forgot the title of the other one. And then of course, when Rip Torn, Coming Apart, that film that was made in the early 70s too, of breaking, you know, in a sense, where no longer the role can be played, and then there becomes a question of identity. So this blurred distinction that you bring up with Lacan is very, very interesting in this regard. I just want to read one thing from what David was citing. This is in section 10. The film responds, right, to the shriveling of the aura with an artificial buildup of the personality outside the studio. The cult of the movie star, fostered by the money of the film industry, preserves not the unique aura of the person, but the spell of the personality. This is all on page 231 in the Hannah Arendt introduction text. But anyway, you know, in section 10, a little bit in. Preserves not only the unique aura of the person, but the spell of personality, the phony spell of a commodity. And this is interesting too, how he goes into the commodity and then, of course, the fetish again, right? So long as the movie maker's capital sets the fashion, right? As a rule, no other revolutionary merit can be accredited to today's film than the promotion of a revolutionary criticism of traditional concepts of art. We do not deny that in some cases, today's films can also promote revolutionary criticism of social conditions, even of the distribution of property. However, our present study is not specifically concerned with this, than is the film production of Western Europe, right? So it's interesting, right? It is inherent in the technique of film, as well as that of sports, that everybody who witnesses its accomplishment is somewhat of an expert. This is interesting too, that you become the expert on, you know, professional sports, right? Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm the expert on the Golden State Warriors, right? Because I watch them, I'm careful with them, you know, et cetera. I love Curry, I love the passing, the +1, you know, I study these things, but I'm not an expert. You know, I'm not a pro basketball coach like Steve Kerr and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, this is obvious to anyone listening to a group of newspaper boys, and I read this last week. This is very interesting, leaning on their bicycles and discussing the outcome of a bicycle race. So the cult of the audience is really working here too. So this is how clever he is in this very beautiful, I think, dialectical construction. It is not for nothing that the publishers arranged races for their delivery boys. So this was back in the 30s, but we can think of what happens today, right? Right. So and so shoots hoops, for thousands of dollars, sponsored by soft drink companies or whatever. Okay, they arouse great interest among the participants, for the victor has the opportunity to rise, and this again feeds the fantasy, from the delivery boy to professional racer. Similarly, the newsreel offers everyone the opportunity to rise from passerby to a movie extra. In this way, any man who might find himself part of a work of art had witnessed Vertov's, and I recommend seeing this, 3 Songs About Lenin, or Joran Ivans's Bornage. Any man today can lay claim to be being filmed. So I think this is great, David, that you oriented this here with this, this really crucial set of passages in terms of the social effects of all of this, and this tension between the creation of the cult of celebrity and the cult of audience, and how this interplay takes on gigantic proportions today. Yeah.
If I could, Michael, just to point to the very beginning of that section, you started, like, the beginning of the paragraph that you started halfway through is fascinating too, where, like, the feeling of strangeness that overcomes the actor before the camera, that he then goes on to describe, right, is this feeling of estrangement that I think we could point to as, like, the general condition of social life within social media. Like we insofar as we put pictures of ourselves and, like, aspects of our everyday lives, our backgrounds, onto Facebook or whatever, we're, I think, exactly participating in the kind of estrangement that he's locating at the juncture between, like, the actor, the camera, and the eventual public that the actor has to imagine automatically when in front of the camera, right? And that feeling of estrangement now is, like, it's our condition of existence. It's the water that we swim in. We're estranged in that exact way, knowing that our images, that our performances for audiences aren't just for the folks around us, but are always for an audience that's a mass audience that, like, we have to experience as real because we know they'll have contact with us, but that we're, that's it. We don't actually have contact with that audience. So the estrangement that he frames this whole argument with has, I think, become universal in this really fascinating way.
Yeah. I mean, earlier on, not only is not selling, offers not only his labor, but also his whole self, right? And heart and soul, right? Right? The market where he offers not only his labor, but his whole self, heart and soul, is beyond his reach, right? It's very interesting how he's breaking this down and showing this. Yeah, Richard? Yeah.
I think, that the actor before the camera, I mean, one of the things amazing about a really fine actor is they take this very artificial set of circumstances and they make it look, quote unquote, natural. And I think, I think that's the thing, is we are, we produce the natural in a way, that we're involved in through social media and such, producing a sense of what's natural, what is, how do we make the technology disappear in a sense. And the other thing that I was also, to take it towards the level of the present or social media is the ability to film ourselves. In other words, we're not only an audience, we're also filmmakers, that each of us carries around a video camera with them in their pocket and produce these little clips and such. So that to me is something which would be very interesting to think about, how that, that's an element that I think Benjamin anticipates, but of course wasn't the case at his time, and he doesn't mention it, but is the case in ours. And, I'm not sure what to make of it, but they're really today, there are two kinds of professional films made. Those that are kind of like shock and awe, where you go and you go, holy fuck, how did they ever make that? Oh my, kind of these big, huge films. And then there are films that are made that are kind of like, they're close to being amateur films, but they're not. But they kind of, you sit there, you look at them and you kind of think, oh, I could almost do that. There's a way in which their aesthetics are related to the aesthetics of the use of a camera such as anybody with a cell phone these days can do. And there's a sense of there's a kind of way in which it's the opposite of the shock and awe. It's more it's within the reach of the audience's own ideas about what they could possibly do if they were really to, really to focus on it in some ways. So I'm not really sure how to theorize all this, but it does seem to me that the fact that today we can also use a camera, we can, there are programs, my daughter who's here tonight staying with me, but I remember she's now 18, but even when she was 12 or 11, there are these programs where she could take some photos and they kind of edit it together for you. And they give you a storyline and such. So how does that, I guess that too would be involved in some kind of construction of this self in a similar way, but how it's different, I'm not sure.
Well, I think, for me, I'm kind of resonating at one level. The extension of this would be Godard, who is very much against shock and awe Hollywood and deconstructs it constantly, and it's been part of his program for a very long time. When Godard, linked up during his phase, the Maoist phase, with Goran, you could see it was more manifesto-like. But before that, it was always this attempt to say it's really Belmondo playing Belmondo, or my ex-wife Anna Karina, playing herself, right? And he used to say this, it's Delphine Seyrig playing herself. And of course, Chantal Akerman takes this up as well as a filmmaker, who both have, great Brechtian techniques at work in their film. And also a lot of their films are done in black and white too, right? As you remember, right? They on the color spectrum. So this is interesting. And then what you bring up today in terms of technical reproduction, is this generation being fed everything? Again, is it already part of the cult value that the storyboard is there for you as long as you have the images? How do you plug it in? What are we dealing with here? And, this constant, attempt to get away from analogical reasoning, right? Or dialectical reasoning into this kind of new positivism of everything is possible with the technology, right? You too are a filmmaker. Just check out this program. You can put in that story from there, et cetera. And where are we? Yes.
I just want to comment really briefly on a couple things you said. Well, in terms of movies, you mentioned Ingmar Bergman. There's a movie I've always loved. It's called Through a Glass Darkly, which is about Max von Sydow has a wife who's younger and mentally ill, and he brings her back to Faro. And it turns out that she's having repeated breakdowns throughout the film. And then his brother, Max von Sydow's brother, is a writer who actually at the end, it turns out, is utilizing her mental breakdowns to kind of prompt his own inspiration, his own muse. So there's a kind of a bad faith aspect to that, which when you said Bergman was himself picking up the camera, that kind of interesting how he found outlets within the thematic aspect of the films too.
Yeah. So tender is not the night in a way, and let us not go into that night gently is really
the other thing about the
F. Scott Fitzgerald, Dick Diver versus Dylan Thomas in some ways. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the movie I was thinking was Face to Face. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one.
Face to Face by Bergman, which was about the psychiatrist breaking down in front of the patient. Right.
Okay, I have to see that one.
Face to
It
Face.
seems like the French have like preceded and prophesized everything. I mean, I recently saw Agnes Varda's movie Cleo 5 to 7, and that movie is almost revolutionary in the way it portrays a very bourgeois singer, but throughout the course of the day, the way the film is actually technically shot could be seen to deconstruct or break down her reality in a way that I think is perfectly situated in terms of this text.
Yeah, I think part of the inspiration was Juliette Greco in that film, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Richard. Yeah,
there was this great. I was looking at. I don't know what the difference is, but I was looking at what was called the work of art second version,
right.
And there was
three versions, by the way. Yeah.
So, and this where he talks about how he goes here in the section 8 about he's talking about how the film Women of Paris was made out of 3,000 meters long. Chaplin shot 125,000 meters of film. The film is therefore the artwork most capable of improvement, and this capability is linked to its radical renunciation of eternal value, which is, again, to mention Godard, but, this sense of, it's because I don't think we often do think of film in terms of its renunciation of eternal value. But that approach is a very interesting approach, or to think of film as this, there's a Cuban filmmaker whose name I forget, who wrote a manifesto in favor of imperfect films.
Espinosa.
Yeah.
The theory for an imperfect cinema. Yeah.
For an imperfect cinema, where
for the imperfect cinema.
Right. And, I kind of read Benjamin's statement. Yeah, I mean, one of the things Stiegler and Benjamin, the one person they both quote is Paul Valery. And, Valery, who said a poem is never finished, it's only abandoned, that film is the abandoned art. In other words, where you just finally put together a cut. But there's a way in which Benjamin, it seems to me, is implying a certain kind of, imperfection, which is why, for example, in that manifesto, it's where there's room for the audience. The audience is very much involved in, in production. This is, again, I was talking to a friend, a documentary filmmaker in Paris, and who I've known for 40 years. We've worked together, and we were talking about our different approaches. And he was saying, well, his family came from many generations of communists, and he really thought of of making something popular in terms of the Paris Commune of 1871. And when I was saying, well, popular today means you open in cinemas all over the world, but it's a very passive idea versus, his idea of popular, which, really involves the audience in a certain way, and which is complete anathema to this kind of, worldwide shock and awe cinema that's, which now is the only thing you see in cinemas pretty much.
Right. So, the Espinosa could be looked at, one of the imperfect cinema's theses was that the makers of the Latin and South American filmmaking had an advantage because they were not technologized by, Hollywood. They were not part of that technocratic culture. And maybe one way of looking at this, given the language that's out there today, is you could have the guerrillas filmmakers, right, versus that of the shock and awe. you know, in a way. And you see
Yeah.
Baba Rocha, you see, you know, Espinosa, Gutierrez Alea, a whole host, you know, of course, Guzman, you know, et cetera. All of these, you know, great directors that came out of that. And again, the cinematographers in Latin and South America had very clear eyes, a very different approach to cinema versus that of the European or Euro-America, you know, version of cinema. Much more clarity from the natural world, much more clarity of the horizon they would use, you know. I mean, you look at some of the later Guzman, the capturing of the Andes, you know, some of the Peruvian filmmakers. There's a great film of 4 different stories. I think it's called Chicago, of Peruvian people coming to the city, to Lima, right? And their stories. So the 4 narratives overlap with each other, but at the same time, it keeps juxtaposing the mountains and the city, you know, throughout. It's very beautiful. And the, you know, the opening take, if you guys know, if you know Bus 174, the one about the bus in Brazil that was, you know, hijacked, and the police led to many deaths, their actions instead of the actual so-called terrorists, right? But that long take for about 20 minutes, just flying into Rio, what has happened to Rio, you know, very, very beautiful. So yeah, this is good in a sense. Yeah. I mean, I think Benjamin he doesn't really mention it, but it would have been better for him to bring up Vertov, you know, and Eisenstein in context to really talk about film more. But I don't think he had that, you know, in mind here. I think, again, this was a Frankfurt School project, right? This was published, by the way, for the first time in the Frankfurt School Journal. Yeah. This was done in the Frankfurt.
I have a quick question,
Yeah, sure.
Michael. Just one. I was wondering if I could go back to the text just for a moment.
Yeah, sure. of course.
There's a passage that I just want to get your take on, especially because we're going to be going into Stiegler next. And I was reading this today also in terms of, I'm not familiar with Stiegler, but there's at the very beginning, now I've lost it, but there's a very beginning of the essay. He talks about, let me see. Yeah, he's on page 218. He says, I'll just read it. They brush aside a number of outmoded concepts, such as creativity and genius, eternal value and mystery, concepts whose uncontrolled and at present almost uncontrollable application would lead to a processing of data in the fascist sense. And then he goes on and says at the last sentence, they are, on the other hand, useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art. Now, you referred to this earlier today, and I'm just wondering, in terms of packaging, I know there's so many different scintillating insights in the essay, but this one thing here, given what we're going to be reading next in Stiegler, do you think that has proved to be true in the sense that we can demarcate a fascist kind of sense that we fight against, as opposed to the revolutionary potential embedded in cinema, or has the entertainment function that Adorno discovered and has critiqued more dominant today? And I guess this is going to carry over into the Stiegler as well.
I think one thing he's trying to do here is, again, with the aura, his critique of the aura is to render, you know, basically fascist arts useless in its use of the aura. I think this is very important to remember. Benjamin is really trying to render it useless. He's trying to make it impotent, in a way, to say, look, even though Leni Riefenstahl is a great technician, right? You know, and the use of the aura, the camera positions, you know, and we all seen Triumph of the Will. You know, how do you render that ultimately useless in the revolutionary potential of film, right? In some ways, this is where he's going, with this, right? In a sense. And then at the same time, you know, again, I think he understands both sides so well, right? That this auratic value that he keeps talking about, he wants to give art as a, you know, to set aside ultimately. I think the goal of this essay, or it's hypochemian, to go back to the Greek we're doing with Heidegger, the underlying here, and as a sense is to see, you know, the political function is to really neutralize, if you will, right? these moments of aesthetic concept that are built around the aura. right? In many ways. And I think what you pointed out 3 weeks ago, the use of Abel Gance's Napoleon, right, as one of his examples here, is his example of doing that, to try to neutralize that approach in some ways. I mean, Griffin is easy, whereas Abel Gance is a little more complicated, you know.
Yeah.
In terms of, yeah.
I agree that's his goal. I guess the question will be, as we go into Stiegler, whether any of that continues to be articulated in terms of the language of the critique, or whether we've subsumed the critique and we're moving on into a different dimension that doesn't speak to that dialectic anymore. I guess that will be what I'm going to be thinking about, because I'd like to take this into the next lesson and how does.
So you mean as we get into the age of digitalization and the age of hyper-industrial hype and what we like to call late liberalism now, not
right.
Yeah, politically at least. Yeah, Phil. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I saw an interesting film this past weekend that was kind of an attempt to do shock and awe, but you know, with a cast of a star-studded cast with like Leonardo DiCaprio and Meryl Streep and a number of other big, you know, A-list actors, but to try to do something similar to what was done with, you know, the Dr. Strangelove. It was called Don't Look Up. And, you know, they tried to, you know, they're trying to, you know, to do the shock and awe thing, but it opened, like its New York opening was at the Quad, and it was nowhere else. So, you know, and the Quad is probably the second smallest art house in New York, and you know, it was really, and I read the reviews of it too, and it was really kind of fascinating because people either loved it or hated it, and I think it's a film that I enjoyed it. It's really sort of an attempt to mime what is going on currently in society with you know, with disasters, and I find it, you know, interesting that that it's being buried, you know.
Yeah, no, I understand, but you know, a good example would be, what would Benjamin, you know, how would you write, say, a West Side Story, right? This thing, a kind of, you know, part 2, right? A remake, right? How do you think about this as a work of art and a film in the age of technical reproduction? Has capitalism so devoid and deprived of ideas, right, at this point, or to put it in Adornian terms, the culture industry apparatus, right? And you know, is this so devoid of ideas that all they can do is repeat at this point? And they get the people to repeat are the wealthiest, or those that are the best known that start to do this, that come in and make a film like this, right? Because they don't have ideas anymore. So this is a question in capitalism. Do they run out of ideas that they begin to have to repeat, that it becomes almost like a, you know, automatum in some ways, you know, like a psychic automatism, as Lacan speaks of, rather than real repetition and working through the time? This could be a, you know, a very good discussion about, you know, the mechanical reproducibility, or if you will, or on the technical reproducibility. So, you know, so West Side Story would be, I mean, I saw some, I mean, to me, I mean, you know, you know, the original, what's wrong with it really? I know it didn't have any Puerto Ricans, a Greek played a Puerto Rican, but he could dance. Anyway, I'm being very stereotypical here, but he was a very good dancer. And anyway, and Natalie Wood wasn't the greatest actress in the world, but, you know, she had the face of Maria, right? I mean, you know, that's another thing. So, yeah, Why remake it at this point? I mean, that's a question. And to my mind, I mean, I haven't seen it. I have to admit, I don't know if I'm going to go or not. But anyway, I doubt it really gets into what happened to that West Side, to Hell's Kitchen, in terms of gentrification. That there's no tension in this film at all. It's all going to be about the musical, right? In some ways, and how do we, recapture that as, quote, cult and audience, cult value, right? In a sense. So how does this?
Nostalgia.
Yeah. And what? I'm sorry.
Pure nostalgia.
Pure nostalgia. Okay, I can hear that. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, also is,
Can't come back to the class if you defend Spiegelberg. No, I'm just kidding.
I was about to say, I'm shocked that you still have any idea that there might be anything of intellectual value in Spielberg.
Yes, I have none. No,
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Bringing him up versus the earlier one. I had no value in the first one, but anyway,
Yeah, okay.
I just want to say how this is. It's like Breathless 2 with Richard Gere instead of Jean-Paul Belmondo. How many of these, quote, franchises? Because as we know, how many Planet of the Apes, The Return of the Apes, et cetera. How many attempts do we have to have with Caesar, right? Going forward. So I think this is something that Benjamin is pointing to as well, right? Subtly, he doesn't outright say it, but how will this happen? And you basically have seen, more of Marinetti, right? And Riefenstahl operative in entertainment than you have in any versus any kind of revolutionary cinema, right? In a way, I mean, most people today cannot go see Godard because they can't keep up with the references. It makes no sense to them. Unless you understand the intellect and the references he's making, I mean, it's impossible to follow. They just say, what is this? Et cetera. I mean, why is God the son of Alexander Dumas? And, the one that gives the miracles in Weekend, et cetera. So anyway, I'm just saying, Richard, you were going to say something. I'm sorry, I'm going on.
no, I was just going to say that also is with these, with remakes, is that large amounts of capital always are adverse to risk. So they're trying to, ensure, quote unquote, their money. So they try to, they like, whether it's big stars or big names in particular roles behind the camera,
Sure.
but the remake, the tentpole series of comic book films, it's a way of insurance. They both have to find somewhere these large amounts of capital, to go to work. So they're larger amounts of capital, but they're also trying to repeat the same thing as much as possible. They don't want to take chances. So there's a tendency to that kind of repetition.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes they're exceptions, and they're exceptional films are made, but it's as Godard said, Hollywood, its ideal would really be now is to only make one film a year. They're not really interested in films at all. It's really these corporations that own corporations that own corporations, and they're just crunching numbers. And so there's very little interest in any kind of innovation as such. Though of course there are films that are exceptions to that rule, but generally these remakes are, from their perspective, make a lot of sense.
Well, you look at the United States, for example, during the 70s, which was the emergence, of course, of Scorsese, right, and others, around that ilk, and of course Coppola. And someone was telling me the story that they were reading Capital, Coppola, and who was it else? It wasn't Scorsese, it was someone else when the Godfather was being made.
I think that's right.
Yeah, they were reading Capital. So that's interesting to me that was happening. That's a great essay right there with some research. But anyway, I mean, you look at a guy like Bob Rafelson, you know, Stay Hungry, King of Marvin Gardens, and of course the masterpiece, 5 Easy Pieces. He was blackballed, right? Just too intelligent for Hollywood. You could not sustain a career unless you had, you know, the blockbuster like a Coppola or the following that a Scorsese had. You had to have that audience effect. You know, I mean, Rafelson had some of an audience, but not, you know, any kind of major audience during this period. One guy that was really shut out of that moment, that moment, right? And, you know, not to be heard from again.
Yeah.
You know, Stay Hungry is a great film, and nobody says anything about it, about bodybuilding, right? It anticipated the entire culture of the workout culture. Jeff Bridges plays this muscle man in Alabama, right? And it's very, very interesting, you know, anticipatory. Just like The King of Marvin Gardens is much better than Louis Malle's Atlantic City, with Nichols, Ellen Barkin, and excellent. Yeah, please.
And there used to be, you know, of course, not Lenny Riefenstahl. Oh my God, Lina Wertmüller just passed away. Lenny Riefenstahl, but
you know, the opposite sides of the spectrum. Yeah, they both like to swim.
Both like to swim, exactly.
We're just Swept Away. And I'll tell a story about Swept Away in a second.
But I've always wanted to do a book about short ends, filmmakers, right? You know, who would, like, her first film, Fellini gave her the short ends of film he had made, and you know, there's Wim Wenders giving his short ends, and Jim Jarmusch, which is the end of a canister of film. And so, you know, if you, which used to be a major expense for making a film. So, I mean, one of the things it did is it created this, you know, this lineage, this transmission of kind of giving the ability by taking what was left over after shot, those canisters, and then, you know, the filmmaker afterwards would often make a scene as long as the shot. You know, he'd see how much film he had. He said, well, we've got 2.5 minutes, so we'll make a 2.5 minute scene. So there are these kind of limitations, but also this, you know, again, this sense of transmission between different generations of filmmakers and everything, which is a totally different, you know, political economy of filmmaking than these kind of just mammoth, you know, things.
Yeah, the story I was going to tell, bringing up Lina Wertmüller, is Aronowitz and Marcuse went to see this in San Diego when it first came out in the 70s, right? So they're in the theater. I think Stanley was sitting in the front, and Marcuse noticed them, and Marcuse yelled out, "How did you like the film, Stanley?" "Oh, it was very good, Herbert." "There's something wrong with your aesthetic, Stanley." To him about anyway, pretty funny. There's nothing wrong with your aesthetic. And he was writing aesthetic theory during that time, kind of outlining it. And of course, Stanley, "It's not that good of a book," right? The aesthetic dimension. Of course, I had to hear this too in many ways.
That's great.
Yeah. So, was something wrong with your aesthetic? So, yeah. David, you want to say something, Salvage? Or Dave?
No, I was just listening.
Okay. Nice to see you, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're here. Thank you. Yeah, good. I mean, no, this is a good lead-ins, the short ends, of course, Agnes Varda did that wonderful film, The Glissant, right? They go, and it's a wonderful film, right? Yeah. She's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the thing is here, is to remember here in a sense is that he really sees Dadaism as a real, avant-garde movement, right? Benjamin. He thinks Dadaism is really confronting the futurist manifesto, the Marinetti. He understands how easy this is to capture the masses. He really understands that struggle in terms of consciousness, the struggle for consciousness. constantly, in a sense, right? In Benjamin's case. And this was always a thing that he seemed to have much more hope than Adorno in this moment, right? He had much more hope for this moment with mass culture, if you will. Yeah, in a way, and the high-low distinction did not really work so much for Benjamin, in a way, much more
in terms of the present, there's actually a German woman with not a German sounding name, Hito Stero,
right,
who's wrote a book called The Wretched of the Screen,
right,
which kind of talks about the poor image. And, like today, if you try to sell your film to Netflix, they'll only accept 4K. So, but there are all this extraordinary work that's just been ostracized because it's poor images, it's standard definition, it's not high definition, it's
right.
there all this amazing work which is done with a completely different aesthetic, which doesn't kind of fetishize this 4K or this very dense image, which has been a way to kind of dominate. And and again, you mentioned Agnes Varda. This was what made me think of it, where she did that great film, using just a little handheld camera, and which is what Godard has done, and also Lynch has done with Inland Empire, using these really small, inexpensive cameras, which is really empowering us that, versus kind of, and Steven Soderbergh as well, using an iPhone.
The High Flying Bird. By the way, Kristen, did you see High Flying Bird? It's about basketball lockout. It's an amazing film done with the iPhone cameras. High Flying Bird, it's called. Yeah, it's very, very good, with the actor Andre Leonard, and it's about the NBA lockout, and it cross-cuts images in black and white of three major rookie stars, one of whom's Donovan Mitchell, Karl Anthony Towns, all big names in the NBA. And it's about the story of a recruit during the lockout and how he's going to accomplish his goal of actually getting a paycheck. And it's very, very interesting. And it's based on Harry Edwards's The Revolt of the Black Athlete, on the story of how the Olympiads in Mexico City, '68 happened. Yeah. And so it's a great film. I mean, really a great, and Richard just, said the handheld, he used 21 iPhones to do this. And the first sequence is a very rapid set of takes about a thing where the agent's credit card's not working. He's cut off during the lockout to use the credit card because no one's getting paid for the contracts. It's very funny, but it sets up the film. So yeah, please see that. Yeah, and speaking of handheld cameras, Godard, by the way, people interested in this, the technical aspects, and I'm sure Richard is, and talked about the use of the Aeroflex. He has a long conversation with Goron that's reproduced in Camera Obscura. Conversation about the handheld camera as an extension of the hand. And going back to Benjamin again, this is about the hand and the eye. It's about the tactility, the tactile unconscious, as well as the optical unconscious. This is what I think this work of art is really about, to bring it back to the Marxist premise of the theoretician of the senses. It's about tactility and seeing too, this art of seeing.
And also is that he, it's true, it's very evident in the second version. I don't know if it is in the final one. I don't remember it from the final one, but it was clear that he's visited film sets, that Benjamin has done his homework. He's not only done his reading, but he's kind of gone out and spent time really looking at the practice of filmmaking at his time, and analyzed and thought about it in terms of what it involves, in terms of the mind and how they're thinking.
Right, right. Kristen had something good in the chat about never notice embodiment as much was when you're trying to get a certain shot, right? That's kind of interesting, huh? The Gestalt, how the Gestalt takes away somewhat from the embodiment, right? And in a way, the enframing itself, right? The frame itself begins to take away from that. It's a very interesting thing, I think Merleau-Ponty, by the way, mentions that on the psychology of film and in the phenomenology of perception, right?
Yeah.
In the body and the image, right? So it's interesting. So listen, we can go back to Benjamin. I thought I would, maybe introduce Stiegler and we can start to get in. He's a very complicated thinker, to put it mildly. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He passed away, the summer of 20, when was it, 22? Just
2020.
recently, 2020, right? Yeah.
Last year.
Yeah, last year. And unfortunately, there are rumors that it was a suicide, that he had a life-threatening illness, etc. And just didn't want to go on anymore. But I'm not sure. I don't know the facts. When I do, I'll be the first to tell you, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's private, knowledge here, or a big secret. But anyway, all to say, a pretty remarkable character, to put it mildly. This is someone who came up on the left as a Trotskyist leftist in the 60s. Hung around. Many of his very good friends were party members. He was a CP member, Parti Communiste Français. He owned a jazz club. He was very interested in jazz. It was the club that he had was a place of heavy drug distribution, and he was brought in on charges in which he was supposed to rat out the dealers. He would not do it, right? So this was something that he earned a lot of currency from this. He wouldn't rat out the French mob or whoever was involved at this time. So no police consciousness there. He ended up with the jazz club. He was watched very carefully, of course, by the police for this, etc. There was probably a concerted effort to make sure it didn't, stay in business. But he ended up knowing that he was running a negative balance sheet. He started to rob banks, and he was successful in the beginning, but he got caught and he was sentenced to a very long prison term. He went to prison for 4 or 5 years. He was in prison. He started to read philosophy there, and he began a communication with an old, I guess he was a friend from in the past, Gerard Grenelle, who had a publishing company called the Trans-European Express, who published a lot of authors that Gallimard thought were too hot to handle. So Grenelle began a correspondence with Stiegler, and he started to read philosophy systematically. So every morning he would start by reciting poems of Mallarmé and Rimbaud, right? It's kind of interesting. He would go through these daily exercises. He's recounted this in some of his works. One of his most impressive works about his background is a book called, in English, called Acting Out, or It's Necessary to Pass the Act in French. Passing the act is really what he used in his thing about, what his repetition was. He began to read Husserl very actively. Grenelle was a kind of Husserlian - Heideggerian phenomenologist, and Grenelle put him in touch with Jacques Derrida. So this was the beginning of the launch, if you will, of Bernard Stiegler's career. He spent about 4 to 5 years there. He and Derrida developed a long correspondence, became friends. he started to work out his dissertation while in prison, that he wrote at the Sorbonne when he got out. And so he had no official, like some people I know, like Aronowitz didn't go to class, or, etc. A lot of people that I do know and admire greatly didn't go to many classes that ended up very well. So, but this is not the story of Jack Abbott. It's more closer to a highly intellectual Genet without all the other, problems that went along with Genet, including being a collaborator during the war. Stiegler was, so he got out and he started with analysis of TV, the notion of the image and TV, and he did a book called Echographies with Derrida, an analysis, TV analysis, which if you like Raymond Williams' stuff, this is a very good extension of Raymond Williams' work on TV. He started to become very interested. He read Being in Time very seriously, many, many years. And he, started to write full-fledged books, right? And including this multi-volume, projected 5 volumes, Technics and Time, right? Of which we have 3 volumes, right? The 3rd volume is what he, in his introduction, if you read the introduction, and it's dedicated to Derrida, by the way, he said, chronologically, this is the best place to start with his ontology. This is his ontology, if you will, Technics and Time. Yeah, the 1st volume is about the fault of Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, right? Not the one who steals fire, but the one that lives what he calls the default. We are prosthetic by nature, according to Stiegler. We are not, these giants, with dwarfs, etc., living around. We do not steal fire in this way, or steal knowledge so much. We're shaped by technics, right, in a way. And he gets this from another person that's not read in the American university actively enough, André Leroy-Gourhan, whose famous book is in English. It's expensive, Gesture and Speech. 2 volumes in French, but it was put together in a book, very, very important, about the use of the hand and gesture and speech, the speaking subject in history. Very, very important to Stiegler. The other major influence that's not read actively in the United States or in academic prose, Gilbert Simondon, who was a student and a friend of Gilles Deleuze, on technical objects, right? Again, someone very close to Benjamin in a way, looking at technicity in a very active way, the objects in the world, right, in a sense, right? And and I want to mention, if you're really interested in this stuff, this Siegfried Gideon that I mentioned, Mechanization Takes Command, is a very important text for Benjamin in the work of art in the age of technical reproduction as well. And I think has a very much of an impact on Stiegler, even though he only mentions them in passing. But the 2 major outside influences, again, are Leroy-Gourhan and Gilbert Simondon, who are not read actively in the, and he'll use terms like individuation, transindividuation, much of which, and disindividuation, which he takes from Simondon, these processes. It's not really an ecological development that we go through. It's this individuating process, always as part of a process that becomes the trans individuation, which is really the society, the relationship that we have with the society that we inhabit. So he's a very advanced thinker, to put it mildly, in this way. So this is his ontology that we're reading, the 3rd volume, because he deals with the question of cinematic time and cinematic consciousness. So he's raising this question of what is it to protend, to project something, to have it out there as attention, the future, if you will, and retention, memory, and more than memory too. And, he'll use the example, there's a lot of musical examples here. He loves jazz. He wrote a brilliant piece on, by the way, on Charlie Parker and listening to Lester Young and repetition. I mean, it's a pretty amazing piece about repetition in jazz, right? Because most of you probably know Lester Young was part of the Kansas City group, and Bird used to sit there and just listen to him. And that's when Bird picked up the thought. They would carry around LPs and a phonograph all over the, yeah, the old, 78s, and yeah, and carry them around and listen all the time. And you can hear this in the early Charlie Parker stuff. So Stiegler is very much into, repetition through protension and and retention in the Husserlian senses, that we have an object before us, and how do we retain that? How do we protend it? What is this tension that is going on between the memory and the object, and these relations between things? It's a very, very interesting moment. So he's going to critique this too, in terms of what cinema does in this chapter on cinematic time. And let me just say this too. This is important. Husserl wrote a book called Internal Time Consciousness, the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. And this is a crucial book for Heidegger in terms of his notions of temporality and Zeitlichkeit, and is present throughout being in time, many, many ways. So even though Heidegger doesn't use the term Bewusstsein, consciousness, at all, right? Husserl does. Heidegger certainly takes up this internal constitution of time very actively in this book, the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. And Derrida begins his career with the notion of genesis and structure and the notion of beginning in Husserl, right? So this is another interesting aspect here of the influences on Bernard Stiegler, in terms of temporality and of course consciousness, right? So we'll actually go into that, etc. So anyway, remarkable character. He wrote another group of books on. We're going to read also from, and Josh mentioned this earlier, The Lost Spirit of Capitalism. I like the translation better. Capitalism has lost its mind. Which is translated. I think it would be much more important for us to look at that way. And Josh mentioned the social pathology of everyday life. And I know Beryl, Phil, maybe Patrick too. We did this in the introduction to Stiegler a couple of last summer of COVID, right?
Yeah, we read it once.
First wave. We read that, yeah.
But it reads much differently the second time. It reads much differently after reading what we read already. So
now we're talking. Yeah. Now we're really talking. Good. All right. Good. So anyway, I also want to read, the automation of the superego, and I want to look at this too in the notion of cop consciousness too, since Kristen's here, and this kind of policing that is everywhere. We're going to see it, and now that New York City has blacks in Copland, so to speak, right, as its new mayor, and we're going to see, and we have a woman now head of the the department, right? He had to, all politically correct now. We're on point, right? Who says we're going to be better than ever as NYPD. So this will be interesting to show how the superego, in the Freudian Lacanian sense, is automatized in this notion. He's very smart, this guy. You don't have to agree with him, but he's very smart, Stiegler. He also wrote a great book called Critique of Political Economy, which is an attempt to synthesize Jean-Pierre Francois Lyotard's work on the postmodern condition, right? And the libidinal economy that he develops that with a critique of political economy, right? He goes through this very, very actively. Symbolic misery, to me, is one of his most important contributions in taking care of generations. He's very much engrossed, if you will. It's a passion with him about the transmission to the next generation. Very engrossed in this. I admire this deeply. He formed his own school with his wife, His daughter, by the way, is a very high-powered theorist in her own right. 2 books on Nietzsche, one on Nietzsche and tragedy, one on biology, and her latest book is It Necessary to Adapt? And she's done an intervention on COVID, about a 69-page text on the COVID, on the pandemic, right? What does the pandemic mean? And is all over French TV, et cetera. Yeah, she's been to Columbia, by the way. She actually gave a talk at the Brooklyn, one of those 15-minute impromptus at the Brooklyn Public Library, that French night that happens on, and I think it's in February, they usually do it. Yeah, she was there. Yeah, she and Catherine Malibu, right? Who was, I think, Stiegler's first wife. So anyway, all to say, another first-rate French philosopher out of the Derridian tradition. So the influences here, just so you know, I mean, there are many, many cross influences, and Stiegler, of course, himself is an original. It's an original thinker, but it's a kind of a, an amalgamation, if you will, and a lot of synthetic grounding that comes from Derridian grammatization instead of the ages of epochal thinking. He talks about grammatization. And there's a kind of opposition that he creates between the epochs of time versus grammatization. He'll begin to read history in terms of writing, the ages of grammatization, right? Like, and Derrida's classic 1967 text, De la Grammatologie, that was out there. And certainly influenced by French psychoanalysis. There's Lacan. He wrote a book also recently that's out that we can certainly look, or I can refer to. I've read it, The Age of Disruption, which is an attempt to recast the debate between Foucault and Derrida on madness, right? The reading of, the cogito and the history of madness, right? What is the cogito? What is reason versus madness in history? And this was a very interesting thing, that took place, this debate, and he revisits this in today's world. So speaking of how Joss says we read it differently, well, Stiegler reread this debate that Foucault and Derrida had in the when Madness and Civilization was published, History of Madness. And of course, we got the abridged edition in the States. We got the 180-page edition because we, instead of the 600 pages that Foucault read. But Derrida took one little section on Descartes and the dream of Descartes and built a whole essay around this. So this influence is certainly there in The Age of Disruption, a later piece of his. But again, what impresses me the most is the care, taking care of generations. He's very much about, the care of transmission. What does that mean? How do we go through this practice, if you will, of transmission? Et cetera. And he understands very well digitalization, and he's actually against these notions of the Anthropocene, right? He wants to go way beyond that into negotrophic scenes, right? He wants to go back. So he gave a series of lectures about 2 years before his death on the negotrophic scene, right? And negantropy. And this is very interesting too, that he argued with Peter Sloterdijk on this. Another major influence, as I said, was Leroy Gourhan and of course Simondon, right? There's the book on education, great book, great title, Knowledge and Stupidity in the 20th Century. It's called States of Shock. Knowledge and Stupidity in the 21st Century, excuse me. Yeah, we had enough in the 20th. We have even more in the 21st, right? And, he's very good in this book too. He has a review of the post-structuralists. So he reviews the lacks in Derrida, Deleuze, Lyotard and others. So it's very, very good at recapitulating this and then talking about education at the end, and again, like I said, he had alternative educational projects, including this thing in the south of France with his wife. They had a school there, an alternative school. What else? Yeah, I mean, pretty massive work. He had his own group at the Pompidou Center, Ars Industrialis. that they put out 2 manifestos, a rewriting of one 2005 that was rewritten in 2010, which was trying to take the best of the digital technologies and use them. Very much like Benjamin, don't let this get in the hands of the fascistic temptation, if you will. In whose hands does it go? And if some of you, since Godard came up, if you remember Eve Democracy, she won't let herself be commodified in Godard's. If you remember Eve Democracy from the early Godard period, she would not allow herself to be taken in by the media, right? She would not allow herself to be interviewed. So Godard, knew very well how things could be co-opted very quickly. So so Stiegler raises, some of these questions of co-optation, et cetera. So again, going back to this book, The Lost Spirit of Capitalism, the section on the automation of the superego is an argument with Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, by the way. It's a very, very dense argument. Not just an extension. He's very respectful, but it's a very, very dense. And so we're going to look at that too. And we'll read the social pathology, of course, of May of '68. Maybe Josh can say a couple of things about this tonight. So anyway, yeah. But cinematic time, he advises that we read, his ontology through this volume first. It was a 5-volume projected. And like I said, the French copy is 3 volumes in one. It's about this thick. I took it out at the library in Montreal and saw it. But if you see in the introduction, he talks about the last book that never came out that I know of, and I'm sure his daughter will pick this up. It's called The Necessary Default. Right, this was going to be the 5th and final part of the ontology, the necessary, and then this was the projected work. This was supposed to replace that. He thought it worked better. So I don't know. I know Patrick has a good background in Kant, and I'm sure some other people too. There is a long thing here with the Critique of Pure Reason. He's reading. The way I like to go about things, and I think it's important, see what these people were reading when they were writing this stuff. And you begin to see, how this is meshing and coming together. But anyway, very, very, very interesting what he does with it. And yeah. Many ways. And actually the introduction to the history of cinema, which I don't think it's been translated, Richard may know, but Godard's history of the cinema is just sound and image, right? That's all he does. He just reproduces, one book on sound, one book on image, and he does cinema. He does this history of cinema through just reproduction of images, right? From the cinema, which he considers to be your encyclopedic, notion of cinematic consciousness. Yeah, Richard, do you know Godard's? If the Histoire du Cinéma is in English? No, you're muted. I'm sorry. Yeah.
As far as I know, it's not.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary, work. It's
right.
Really quite extraordinary, and he's provided again this small book of interview he did with Ishaq Pur, this Iranian-born French, actually Iranian-born Jewish French film critic, which is fascinating about how it's structured. It's really quite memorable, very long and voluminous work, but as far as I know, it's not available in English. No.
Okay. So let me ask, how many people have any encounter with Stiegler besides outside? No, none, huh? Really? Yeah, I know Josh has to a degree, right? And yeah.
What do you mean?
And David, yeah.
Encounter. What do you mean?
Well, read him. That's what read. Yeah, I don't mean an actual. Meeting with him. Yeah, I was in the process of writing him, unfortunately, and he passed away. I wanted him to, we wanted to maybe get him involved a little bit with the Institute in New York. So it's a shame. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. very accessible from my understanding. Yeah, yeah, yeah. By the way, and I think some people know this already, the film Der Ister, right? Daniel Ross, who is probably the American most responsible for the dissemination of Stiegler's work, is worth seeing. Stiegler does a commentary in that. Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and the filmmaker Hans-Jürgen Cederberg also has a commentary. 4 commentaries on Holderlin's poem and the river, and then the last sequence is Heidegger reading the poem. And from his class, so Heidegger gave a talk on that. Yeah, and very, very interesting. So
Yeah.
Stiegler has that appearance in that way. Okay, so yeah, we'll try to take it slow. He's complicated again. He's the one that recommends reading this first. It's not me. I'm following Bernard Stiegler here himself, in a way. And I again, as introductions, I really like The Lost Spirit of Capitalism, or Capitalism's Lost Its Mind, or really it's a play on Max Weber, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. He's basically saying, capitalism has lost its spirit, right? It no longer has it. And this was actually a response to, again, the French are always in sort of dialogue in the present moment. This was a discussion, Boltanski and Chiapello's book on the new spirit of capitalism, in which they went through a whole new thing. And I don't think this was ever really received well or read in academic departments in the United States. It's a huge tome. I can go. I have a copy in the other room, but anyway, it's a huge tome. I've looked at some of it, but I remember Josh was very interested in some of the sections they had, right? The Stiegler sites, right?
Yeah. I mean, my friend who goes to, he's at Columbia. He said he's read portions of it too.
Who is this at Columbia?
My friend John.
Oh, your friend John. Okay.
I
got you. Yeah.
I think some people read it.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting thing that kind of anticipated, in a way, the quote, kind of left liberalism of the France of the Mitterrand and beyond, right? That kind of took place, that Badiou was very much against, and others. So he'll speak to that there. But anyway, let me go to the introduction tonight. For a little bit from Stiegler, because this is important, because he is working on his earlier work, so it's kind of unfair to begin here in some ways. But let me just start with what he's doing here. The second volume, and to me the most important part theoretically of Stiegler for our purposes, and we're not for time, but really in terms of what's happening, the industrialization of memory, which is in the second volume, right? And this is where he goes through the whole thing of retentional finitude and speed and urgency of risk. This is I have every page marked with pencil in the margin. I mean, this is a very dense, I'll show you. It's like, yeah, I'm looking back at this, with questions and all this. But anyway, it's, if you become interested in him, this to me is a crucial essay in terms of where you go. The industrialization of memory, which is chapter 3 of volume 2, Technics and Time. Sorry to be such a pedagogue here, but it's an important, important chapter. Very, very important chapter. Yeah. And I think it's very prevalent for our times. Yeah, very, very prevalent, right? And he goes through Leroy Gourhan, and very interesting on the biological synthesis, which is towards the end, what to do is to say, and about the pandemic. I think it's very interesting. I think his daughter riffs on this very, very actively. So anyway, this is an important background text. And the reason I mentioned it, what makes life living too is another one. He has this notion of the Derridian pharmacon, and we've talked about here in these sessions about the pharmacon, that the poison is the remedy and the remedy can be the poison, and this double meaning of the pharmakos, the pharmacon and this is taken up first by Derrida in a book called, in an essay called Plato's Pharmacy. Yeah, it was written during the Telkel group, in which he problematizes the reading of the Phaedrus, right, about Plato's Pharmacy, etc., which yielded the postcard from from Socrates to Freud, with Socrates, sitting behind Plato telling him what to write. Yeah, it's a very interesting, from Socrates to Freud and beyond, which is a kind of interesting, a long love letter of Derrida's, in terms of philosophy. Anyway, okay, let me go back to this. So I mentioned this section, the second book, which is called Disorientation, which I think we all are in many ways. I mean, I think Heidegger's right. We need paths that orient us. This is the notion of the topos, again, place versus space, right? How do we gain place again? How do we gain the da of the there-ness once again for orientation? How do we reorient, or how do we orient differently? Very important. His second volume is called Disorientation, right? On this prosthetic notion, the necessary fault of Epimetheus. So anyway, he talks about the last chapter of Disorientation. I introduced a thesis, and this is in the introduction to the text, claiming that industrial temporal objects are the century's new determining elements. So in a Hegelian sense, we are determined by industrial temporal objects. The programming industries, and he repeats himself, and more specifically, the mediatic industry of radio, televisual information, mass-produced temporal objects heard or seen simultaneously by millions, and sometimes by tens, hundreds, even thousands of millions of consciousnesses, right? Interesting, because he's going to go into consciousness in this section. This massive temporal coincidence orders the event's new structure, and he uses event to which forms of consciousness and collective unconsciousnesses correspond. Very, very important, right? The industrial temporal objects, this event's new structure, the event of the industrial temporal objects determining us. I repeated this same idea, though in another form, on the fourth page. An object is temporal when its flow, and this is important too, when its flow coincides with the streams of consciousness of which it is the object. For example, a melody, and I hope we can go there. In this new calendarity, the stream of consciousness of global collectivity unfolds simultaneously with the temporal flow of the products of the programming industries, resulting in a disruption of the very process of eventization of what happens, what takes place, what conjugates space with time as time. This disruption also affects the biological event, orders digital, real time, etc. This is very crucial for an understanding, in my opinion, of Stiegler. This introduction that begins on page 1 to the Technics in Time. To analyze the industrialization of memory, and again, I repeat that it's a very crucial chapter. I know we don't have time to read all this in this session, but I'm certainly willing to go back there. To analyze the industrialization of memory, right, which is chapter 3 of the second volume, is to reopen the philosophical question, and this is very important, of synthesis. The unity of the stream of consciousness and of judgment. So both synthesis of stream of consciousness, flow, temporal flux and flow, as well as the question of judgment, and in German, Urteil, literally means to separate out, right? Judgment, to make a judgment means to separate out, right? But with new language, a state of rupture with what, within philosophy, cannot think synthesis that is already prothesis. So this again is crucial. So it is this question of synthesis, thought separately from any originary prostheticity, that will constitute the heart of the reflections I offer here through a reading of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I know we're not reading the Pure Reason, but I think we can get it without having to, this very turgid book. You know, I don't know. He restudied it. It's terribly written. I mean, it's horrible. You know. By the way, an Althusserian wrote a very good book called "The House That Kant Built." He was a jurist. What's his name? I think his name is Fetterman. Yeah, Edelman, Bernard Edelman. He was a jurist, a lawyer, and was an Althusserian. And he wrote on who owns the image. By the way, very good, very clever book. Who owns the image during the Algerian War? Yeah, very, very interesting text by this guy Edelman. Okay, so since the appearance of disorientation, so you can see he's following up his work, but this question of the new synthesis, right? The question of the question of what does it mean to synthesize? What is that ground, right? In a way, and you know, we're sort of questioning this in our own little way. Josh and myself and Bruno Gulli and Kristen, of course, is part of that effort. And Tony, you know, what is the new synthetic ground in convergence philosophy? You know, how do we critique that? You know, what is that ground of the coming together? You know, the synthetic moment, right? In a sense. And, you know, and of course, most of you, Patrick knows, of course, Kant spends, you know, decades on the analytic synthetic distinctions in the critique, as well as what does it mean to synthesize, you know, et cetera. So he's going to go back to this. Okay, so since the appearance of disorientation within the context of the dissemination of temporal industrial temporal object that is suddenly accelerated, and this is written 2003 or 4, I think. So we're, you know, we've accelerated much more, right? Become much more complex in the intense process of digitalization than in the network of networks commonly called the internet characterized the concluding decade of the century just past. This question has been posed with increasing clarity. The internet has become the implementer of standard interoperability among digital infrastructure called TCP/IP that has made innumerable new services, tools, and uses possible, combined with new standards for text, image, going back to what Richard was saying in his daughter, text, sound compression has allowed for the colossal phenomena, right? We now know as the convergence of informational, telecommunications, and audiovisual technology, to which we must now, with the development of mobile technologies, add roaming, right? The computerization of automobiles and the new standards of multimedia, mobile communications, new technologies for metallurgy and the automobile. This resulting disruption, and again, he's saying we're marked by this disruption. This is, you know, yeah, shock and awe, too mild, right? Major disruption, but universally recognized as vital to industrial societies and a decisive stage in the globalization process. So this becomes absolutely crucial for continuing globalization. And you know, the derivative exists since the 70s and even before that in commodity futures. But this is the era in which the derivative really takes over in terms of Wall Street practice, right? The writing of new paper on paper, et cetera, in this process of globalization. So this is important to keep in mind materially or through the political economic. The second step, right, just the first step, which is taking place currently and which will only result in the increase in digital networking, will produce a new kind of temporal object, one that is delinearizable and inseparable, produced by hyper video technologies. So he's really talking about the complete disappearance of analog communication. Yeah. You know, this is why kids, every other word is like, right? They can't figure out what like is, right? What the role of simile is in everyday talk, right? It's just like something, right? Right, in a sense. This becomes a kind of new positivism, new digitalization, if we're going to take care of generations here, in a sense, because, you know, Heidegger was wrong. We're not even close to thinking, much like that we haven't begun to think, you know, in a sense, what he's really presenting there. I mean, he's obviously thinking, and I hope we are, but in a different way. All right. So in addition to the concretization of the processes now in and about to take place, there will doubtless be an increase in the amount of time spent in front of screens of all kind. So, we know this phrase, and, I gave a couple of talks on this to some unions on the new screen deal, right? And what that's really involving. And this is going to be part of online education. Omicron may be the new thing that'll produce the final blow to education in person. We'll have to see. We should be very attentive to this as we go ahead, right? Anyway, time spent, which will then be reconceptualized and redefined in their function, becoming terminals of tele-action. There are various applications, expanding into the thousand, most notably at the professional level. These processes will pursue at an increasingly complex level and with increasing in ease and sensitivity, the industrial temporalization of consciousness. It's very important how we ourselves are becoming industrialized, consciousness, this hyper-industrialization he speaks to. And to me, that's the term that we should be using instead of, neoliberalism, we're living through a period of hyper-industrialization, this industrialization of objects that he speaks about, and the temporal, their temporality is very much with us. This is the disorientation we haven't faced. This is the new form, if you want to use Marxist language, of alienation, right? This disorientation. We can talk about this more, but I think this is very sophisticated in terms of locating where, where we are, since I put "where are we" in the title of this course. The awareness is very important, I think, going, moving into the poetry of the future, if you will. So the convergence in bringing together industrial logistics, informatics, transmission, telecommunication, and the symbolic audio visuals also integrates the functions of technological, industrial, and capitalistic mnemotechnical systems into the technical systems producing material goods. See chapter 4, in terms of facilitating the transmutation of the industrial world into the hyper-industrial. Again, I want to emphasize that term, and subordinate the entire worlds of culture, knowledge, and the mind, along with artistic creation, advanced research and instruction, to the imperatives of development and the market. Markets are above all consciousness, not consciousness, but conscience, our conscience, acting as places for exchange by consumers whose consciousness are themselves consumer goods. Very interesting the way he goes about that. And for market financiers whose consciousnesses are investors and speculators, right? Yet at the moment, as which management has orders to react in real time, thus producing reactivity in the double sense of the words in terms of management as rapidity and ease of adaptation, and in the Nietzschean sense as ressentiment and group behavior against exception. Very, very interesting, right? The functional integration of the symbolic and the logistic industries produces total control of markets as collectivities of a temporal stream of consciousness, always in need of being synchronized. So how does this synchronicity play out in everyday life, in this flux of temporal objects, in this industrialization and hyper now industrialization of memory? Yeah, from the archive to the hyper industrialization. As a consciousness in the 18th or 19th century, and again, I like the way it goes about this, it's very Marxist, and at the same time, it's phenomenological together. It's very interesting the way he takes both. A consciousness in the 18th and 19th century, historical consciousness, sense of the world, is essentially free, right? Interesting, right? That is diachronic, or perhaps exceptionally, singularity, irreducibly mind. This could also be called ipsedity, right? Diachrony and synchrony are tendencies that form and reform ceaselessly, and we will see that they cannot be in opposition over a single significant amount of time without tragic consequences. Yet their composition is precisely what, from the hyper-industrialization of temporal objects, constitutes the possibility of decomposition. Very, very important. Yet as evident and ineluctable as the integration of the logistic, and that's the digital, right? The digital and the symbolic, the alphabetic and the analogic, right? So I'm speaking here in terms of analog digital communication. And again, I recommend someone, you know, again, a part of that San Diego group that ended up at Simon Fraser, Tony Wilden, you know, who was the first to translate. He called himself the unhappy translator of Jacques Lacan, right? I wrote a book called System and Structure, Essays in Exchange and Communication, a wonderful text on analog and digital communication. And, you know, Wilden went on to, you know, study this with Edgar Morin and others in Paris later, right? So anyway, contemporarily, right, as the systematic and unlimited exploitation of consciousness for market access. We know this, but in a way we have to be reminded, right? Again, the culture industry apparatus of the Frankfurt School. But again, he's putting it in more contemporary language. Consciousness as a temporal object is always in struggle. Today is a core issue of the current industrial revolution as it builds the conditions necessary, as I call in chapter 3, a new commerce in the broadest sense of the word, right? The second half of the 20th century, right, through the hegemonic installation of a tele-vision system, 1 billion global televiewers as long ago as 1997, but now the entire global population, this is only 20 something years too, you have to remember, and the internet is 1992. So we're only, you know, less than 30 years. Will be 30-year anniversary of the information highway in 30 years, right? A global consciousness being affected by the same industrial temporal objects became the era of the initiation of the tele-action system, right? So you have all these new programs, the teledoc, right? The telemarketing, you know, all of these things coming out, playing on this word, distantiation in the Greek sense, the telos, right? At a distance, right? With an objective, a goal, an end, etc. Right? This is very interesting. This evolution will continue and expand. What began with television as a process of a profound transformation of the activity of consciousness, activity that's temporal, both in the sense, like a melody, it perpetually unfolds, appearing and only appearing while disappearing, and in the sense in which it is formed in history and evolution, since it is not a synchronic given, but a conquest, a result, and a passage. There are countless forms of consciousness, even if they have their tendencies, their metastable structures and ideal objects are preserved across these evolutions. So anyway, I'm not going to read the whole thing. What do you think? Have you had a chance to look at this introduction, or you know where Stiegler's trying to go here? This is very important to read the next 3 pages. We can keep going on this, but I want to and I want to mention too, epochal. Like Benjamin at the end. The first moment of epochality is that of a process. This is on page 7, is characterized as becoming technical. The second is that of the transforming of this becoming into a future. Today, the conditions of the second redoubling are not integrated. The redouble has no place. Becoming, which has been disrupted, does not produce a future. So again, this idea of progress is taken away as well. This idea where we've talked about the Frankfurt School. So anyway, I hear from you. I know I read a lot of it. I wanted to get us acclimated a little bit to where he is, and I do want to spend at least 2 to 3 weeks on Stiegler, maybe even more if we want to.
Michael, one of the things I found is that I found the introduction kind of dense and a little confusing, and then once I got into the actual body of the text, I think it actually gets much clearer.
Okay. Good.
That was, one thing, but I did have a question. I assume he's going to come back to this, but what he means by a consciousness in the 18th or 19th century sense of the word is essentially free, that is diachronic. Is he talking about a certain kind of ideal representation of a consciousness, the way the word would have been used, or is he talking about an actual historical process of transformation through which he's juxtaposing a formerly more free consciousness? And I don't
talk about this eventization. He's using this term, this process, which he calls the idea. It's an eventization. So for him, the historical structure of consciousness, right, during the period of Smith and Ferguson and the Scottish Enlightenment, when Kant speaks of freedom in the public realm and all of these things, was part of the notion of conscience back in that day, So in some ways, he's looking at that we no longer speak this way. This was a very different period, this 19th and 20th, 18th and 19th century. This is, I think, where he's going. He's trying to look at this in terms of, what's left, right? He's trying to build his argument into what becomes hegemonic in this hyper-industrial.
So he's more talking about like the sort of the philosophic discourse.
Yes.
About how a consciousness is okay.
Right. I mean, even though he's not going to mention slavery and free man and slave, or he's not going to mention the master-slave dialectic of Hegel, or talk about this aspect, he's looking at structures of consciousness, and again, from the standpoint of technological and technocratic rule, if you will, right? But, and these are not, this has not become individual choices. Some people accuse him of technological determinism. I think this is going to be in question. I want to keep that open. Some critics of Stiegler say he's a technological determinist, whatever that means. Yes, he talks about the determination of these objects, of temporal objects. That doesn't necessarily mean he's a determinist in the old sense of that language, right? And this comes up. So yeah. So,
it also tie. I mean, diachrony and synchrony tie into semiotics.
Yes.
In terms
absolutely.
of understanding historical as opposed to a particular period of time. But the diachronic element characteristic of 18th, 19th century is that we, in a sense, are ahistorical in the sense that we have this consciousness above what is going on. This is this notion of the ego that exists at that point in time. So that was, no, but that's, I mean, I think that refers back to, no, the other thing I just found, there's an openness to this. This isn't the Frankfurt School,
right,
in the sense of totally administered world.
I agree.
He talks about, and yet this composition is precisely what, wait, no, there's the other passage. No, but there's just an openness here. I can't find a specific passage I want at this point, but yeah.
Well, he does speak about this notion of the schema, right? Schematism later on, which I did not read. I mean, he mentions Simidon, and then he ends, if you will, with Horkheimer and Adorno address schematism. This is on page 6, right? He's going to really look at the transcendental deduction. I don't, in a sense, I don't want to go behind me and bring out that book. I don't like Kant, but anyway, there's a lot there, obviously. But he's going to work through the transcendental deduction, and especially schematism. And as I think you've pointed out, Patrick, and I think Josh on occasion, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics may be one of Heidegger's great, unread works. It's very important to read this work on the notion of schematism and problematization, in many ways. So he is riffing on that as well, on Heidegger's reading, even though he doesn't mention it. So anyway, let me go. Horkheimer and Adorno address schematism by framing their structural critique as an encounter with the American cultural industry, right? This is on page 6, second to last paragraph. The resultant discourse is obviously at once lucid, if not prophetic, and erroneous. Right? Interesting, right? Prophetic and erroneous, and if not reactionary. It is in some respects among the first clear expressions of the current malaise, seen as a malady that is in the end not to be apprehended nor distinguished, not even properly speaking. Critique, since it is everywhere, at the very material of becoming. This results in a dis-oriented reading of the Critique of Pure Reason that is both non-problematic and acritical. What I read into their analysis, brought back to life after 50 years, which is at once an examination of the United States and a prescient expression of the contemporary malaise as emanating from a United States in which the industrial technology has played such a central role, just as in the malaise that now submerges the public sphere, is the crux of a much more general blockage of thought and much more than thought. This is a very crucial passage. We're going to see this play out with Marcuse in Eros and Civilization in the Lost Spirit of Capitalism. The situation being critiqued here has a very long life that is far from over. Indeed, that it must just become to pass through us. In The Fault of Epimethea and Disorientation, I explore the question and the conditions of this passing, a passing that is time, right? Is time, right? And I explore the question of and the conditions for an exceptional contemporary epochality, right? So again, he's going to rethink this in terms of epochality, right? Whose exceptional difficulty is what I've characterized elsewhere as the epochal doubled, redoubled. This is always a problem for to my mind, always in terms of art as subversive. Does it double or redouble something? Can it be reincorporated into, what happens to the subversive? What is, Tony would know this too. In schools of poetry, there's a conscious effort by some poets to make sure they do not reduplicate language. They do not, essentially go through, et cetera. Yeah. Rimbaud being one. Arthur Rimbaud being a great example of this. Yeah, Tony, go ahead. Yeah, the French symbolists, for example.
No, and also in the modernist sense, the immersion of the reader in the unfolding of language, the language is having its own sort of materiality.
Yes.
Rather than language in its classic sort of mimetic function, right?
Right.
Yeah.
No, very good. So the redoubling, the doubling and the redoubling and the duplication and reduplication are always an issue to a thinker, right? This is very important. Why Heidegger brings up the whole question and deconstructs representation. He knows exactly where this is going to lead. In that sense, he's incredibly subversive, despite, the national German welfare state, National Socialism is supposedly, long affiliation there, right? So he's very well aware of this. There's questions of representation, how something is represented. Marx too, the method of, presentation is different than the method of, of research. Very, very important about this. Marx understood this, I think, very well in the methodological Vorstellung, Darstellung distinctions. Yeah, very early on. So I think this is a very important thing to keep in mind. And he sees, again, an erroneous notion of the pessimism of Adorno and Horkheimer, which I think Patrick openly, suggests, right? That there's an openness here that goes well beyond this culture industry apparatus or the Adorno of aesthetic theory, no poetry after Auschwitz, of course, being one of the famous phrases, of Adorno, et cetera, right? Yeah, in that respect. Okay, so I know, I'm somewhat simplifying it, but I think it's at least gives us some anchoring points, some markers to work with, right? In a lot of ways. Any thoughts about this? Very interesting. The system of technics proper to each epoch, that when it enters into a revolutionary phase, how does technics and this relationship to time constitutes a first epochal redoubling and a first suspension of programs, right? That an epoch is only clearly constituted as such when the suspension of programs, and he puts that in quotation, right, engendered by the technical system leads to the constituting of new programs and a second suspension, a redoubling of doubling, through which a new unity of space and time is constructed, a new psychic, and this is very important, a new psychic and collective, individuation. This is going to be crucial terms for us to do too. Yeah. So, So the first moment of each epochal is that of a process. And again, I emphasize process, not product, not the conclusion, not the telos in the Aristotelian sense, that could be characterized as becoming technical in a way. The second is that of the transformation of this becoming into a future, right? Very, very important, right? Today, the conditions of the second redoubling are not integrated. We're not there, right? The redoubled double has no place. Becoming, which has been disrupted, this is the age of disruption, the becoming, the historical becoming, right? In many ways, does not produce a future. So, in many ways. So this, in a sense, is the aporia, right? The conundrum in which we find ourselves, according to Stiegler. I mean, I think he ends this introduction. This is the conundrum that needs to be addressed. This becomes I think the crucial part of the book. And why do we choose cinematic time, cinematic consciousness, and why do we talk about the question of the malaise, right? Is the age of malaise, right? We went from the age of anxiety, right? Now to the age of malaise, right? In a sense, what he calls symbolic misery, which I like very much as a condition that he writes. He writes a book on symbolic misery. The becoming, his attempt, by the way, is in another book called The Re-Enchantment of the World, which is again another play on Max Weber's The Disenchantment of the World. So anyway, this producing of a future, how do we do this, right? So beginning with cinematic consciousness, the first chapter, and this is very interesting the way he frames this, begins this, cinematic time, first of all, the desire for stories. We all desire, we have to believe in stories and fables, very much like Descartes. Descartes saw, this is a fable, the discourse on the method. I'm telling a story about my education. This is very French in a certain way, but at the same time, very interesting. The passion for fairy tales, just as satisfying in the old as in the very young, is perpetuated from generation to generation because it forges a link between. Beryl's not here. We'll go back to this next time since she works on, the children, children commodities, right? Or children as commodities, right? In some ways, we'll bring this up next week. In Seychelles, they hold out the promise, so to generations to come, of the writing of new episodes of future life, yet to be invented, to be fictionalizing. The ancient desire for narrative still orders modern society. It animates the most complex and the most secret of social movements. But the conditions of this desire satisfaction have been radically transformed. It has now become the object of a global industry. Right? Anyway, what Horkheimer and Adorno, going back here, now constitutes the very heart of economic development. Very important here, yeah? This may be what the U.S. is going to have on the brick and, road mantra of the Chinese, right? Instead, build back better versus, the Chinese approach to international relations. Is this cultural industry, right? It said the key to, full all contemporary design, currently, in fact, increasingly subjugated to the developmental conditions of the technical transmission industries at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st have, in the sense that when we ponder the conditions of the very impossibilities of transmission, at least as an act of inheritance, right? succeeded in becoming both a genealogical connection and the enunciation of the connection between generations. Global commerce develops by mobilizing techniques of persuasion, owing everything to the narrative arts. So it would be a very good way of looking back at Benjamin and the storyteller, right? In this light, the task of the storyteller alongside this there's no event, no moment independent of the desire for stories. Media networks and the programming industries exploit this fictionalizing tendency by systematizing the specific resources of audiovisual techniques. And within the horizon of these immense technological and social issues, cinema occupies a unique place. This is where he's going to begin. In techniques of image and sound, now including informatics and telecommunication, reinvent our belief in stories that are now told with remarkable and unparalleled power. But at the same time, these technical powers can cast doubt on and now sow incredulity into the future of a world to whose disruption they have already greatly contributed. The cinematic narrative's influence on the public results at the most fundamental level from a desire for the most ancient stories, and if this is a desire that can be found in every age, and if that underlies every era of the arts and all techniques, right, for making such stories believable, it is all the more necessary that we analyze and in detail the uniqueness of the techniques that appeared specifically with cinema. So, like Richard mentioned about Benjamin, he would go to the locations, right? We're supposed to go there in terms of learning what is the newest equipment, what is the newest of the technical objects, and their force in our world, right? And how do they order our temporality too? Even more important. Techniques that any others in history have organized the programming industry's production practices, and we must do this in order to account for the incomparable efficacy of the animated sound image, to understand the extraordinary belief-effect, right, it produces in the spectator, to explain how and why the cinema, in becoming television, i.e. the technical network, as producer and diffuser of symbols through a global industry, combines the universal desire for fiction and through it conditions the entirety of humanity's evolution, though at the risk, always at the risk, of exhausting its desire for stories. This analysis is all more necessary, and again, he's always looking at necessary conditions. Remember, the last book is going to be the necessary default, since the cinematic singularity in turn reveals another singularity. And this, again, is important. That of the human soul is such. The cinematic technologically, and he hyphens this, exhumes the mechanism of hidden art in its depths. Very important. How we're going to get out of the, quote, depth psychology of the past.
Michael, just to, when I was reading this in the introduction, it would be interesting to see where he goes. And I just feel like there's been, let's see, I would say in the last 12 years, I guess I would date it to 2010, there really has been some transformation again, I think due to social media. And I think that it's actually, we live in, like the Frankfurt School, it's very much, the corporate dominated culture industry producing mass images that determine consciousness and determine how we understand and perceive and receive the world. And I think that it's interesting to me, I think it's gotten a little more muddied than that, because so much of what is content now is actually produced by the proles, right? So it seems like that would just be a good thing to kind of keep in mind as we go through this, in terms of like, we have lived through another transformation with Facebook and all these other phenomena that are now so dominant. Twitter,
Mm-hmm. one way I would reply to that is saying that he's still looking at cinematic time as being responsible for this, right? And the way, and cinematic consciousness. So he's backing up, if you will, right, in terms of this reflective pose and this reflective activity, right, to kind of understand how did we get here, right, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
In many ways, right? I mean, it's no accident that derivatives led to special project acquisition companies. It's no accident that, you know, problems in the printing of money have led to Bitcoin. You know, that Bitcoin might be better than mining for gold at this point, right? Et cetera. You know, in terms of building something for the future. How do you mine something? What is this changing in terms of things like this? But again, I think what Stiegler is really trying to do is look at this in terms of both temporality and consciousness, right? And that shift. So does Facebook really do, I mean, what is Facebook or metaverse now, which is the new thing, right? And I mean, we're going to be using this word. I mean, the metaverse, right? In a sense, right? You know, I mean, it's some Stanford business school person that took a course in the Frankfurt school that dreams this up, you know, and you know, that goes to metaverse, right? Or a reader of Jürgen Habermas in terms of communicative action, right? How does this happen?
Yeah.
So there are many levels of argument here that are in between. So I don't want to just say we've reached another epochal. I mean, I think his real task here is how do we confront not only this aporia, but how do we get back to becoming again? You know, he's saying we're static in this, you know, in a sense.
Yeah,
You know,
no, I was just saying like his categories that he uses, like that it, you know, again, I'm about 50 pages in, but you know, the idea of the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary retention, right? That the tertiary retention, I think, is my sense of what's really at stake for him.
Yes.
And that it would be interesting to just take his categories and his approach and then sort of try and work it through where we are today. I'm not saying to, you know.
Sure.
Yeah,
no, I understand.
The tertiary, you know, how do we produce the cultural artifact today has become far more, I mean, we do have to admit that it's in some sense far more diffuse than it used to be, I think. So.
Well, he would reply to that in terms of the levels of attention economy too. I mean, he has a whole thing of the attention economy. This is part of his political economy of the day. How do you, where's the attention economy located in a sense, right? And so yeah, nice to see you, David. Thank you for the chat. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we'll certainly go back to this too. I mean, I'd like to, I mean, I don't know how much time, you know, we want to go. You know, Stiegler's got, you know, a whole lot here. I think we have a, you know, the cinematic time we should do for next week, and then we can go to consciousness the time after, you know, the week after that. So we could do the 27th, you know, before the end of the year, we do time, and then at the new year, we'll do consciousness, and then we'll go on to the social pathological into the new year and the automation of the superego. I mean, look, this is again a system of thinking that is very unusual, unique, and in my opinion, very prescient, very contemporary. You know, this is a guy that really was living very much in the moment. You know, he saw what was coming down, and he's really tried to theorize it based on a very different ontology. This is the ontology of a real different kind of ontology that is consciousness and time vis-a-vis the fault of Epimetheus, you know, our prosthesis, how our prosthesis is working, how we're shaped by this again. Yeah, not completely deterministic, but how we become shaped by this. Yeah. So this is very important to remember too. And he'll go into, look, first of all, what do we need stories for? The next section is boredom, right? If you know, the next section is boredom, right? The passing of time. You know, how many people are on their phones late at night just to pass the time, right? In a sense, how many people are filling the void with these empty images that we see on the screen, you know, et cetera, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean, very well with this. Yeah, go ahead, Josh. Yeah,
Just to back Carl up a little bit, I mean, I think you're right. Like, I think it's this thinking about cinema and television is a very good way to start thinking about this. But it does seem like that, you know, when we resort to boredom now, like I know I do, I go on Instagram or YouTube, and the temporality of the reel of the 60 seconds clip that some idiot made somewhere, and you know, from a meme account or something, is much different than even just flipping channels, essentially. You know, like there is a new dimension to this that maybe is kind of meta, that is kind of structured in a different way that I think we should think about.
I'm not saying we shouldn't. I just think we ought to see the structure at work. Right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
How it's coming out. I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, more and more, I'm amazed at the level that this thing's going to.
It gets worse and worse.
It gets worse every day. The question of malaise, and of course, boredom is also ennui, right? The demon of noontide, ennui in a sense. So he's fighting at many levels here, right? I mean, in a sense, right? But he wants to go through this notion of cinematic time. Yeah. I mean, you know, yeah. And of course, he has a section called Hollywood, Capital of Industrial Schematism, right? So he's looking at how, listen, the key here is how does the transcendental imagination work, right? In Kant, in everyday life, right? He's really looking at this. You know, how does this system develop? Right, in a sense. How does the transcendental and the productive, not especially the radical imagination, but the transcendental and the productive imagination in Kant, how does this work beyond that of what the Frankfurt School has done? And why they were wrong, and what you said, Carl, we've gone much further than the culture industry apparatuses, right, of Adorno and Horkheimer, which was written in, you know, in the 40s, right? They're looking at a very different Hollywood. And as Richard was pointing out, the formula, you can make one blockbuster a year, and, you know, AT&T's, you know, Discovery Channel, you know, makes it big and contributes to shareholder value. This is all they're thinking about at this point, not the quality of the work. There's no Irving Thalberg, and he was a monster, right, in a complete sellout. But Irving Thalberg used to say we should make one really good movie a year and not make any money to show the public we're serious, right? And Thalberg used to say this about stuff. Yeah. So, yeah.
I had a question, you know, maybe this is premature, but, you know, just Patrick, if you've studied Kant in depth, I'd be very interested in hearing your impressions of, or how well you think he understands, or, you know, just
a scholar. He's not, the thing to remember, I'll let Patrick answer you, but he's not a scholar of Kant. There's a use here that's going on, but right. He's not, you know, he's not supposed to be pure Kant, right?
Right. Oh yeah. No, I know, but the detail that he's getting into things is it's sort of beyond it's been a long time, and, you know, he's very particular about going over certain passages and pulling out certain words, and, you know, like it's interesting what he's doing. So.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, it's not that difficult in Kant. I mean, Heidegger actually is probably one of the best commentators, because he talks about there's two different ways in which to understand the imagination. And I think the Frankfurt School, and this is interesting because both of them, at least I know Adorno did, and I think Horkheimer did too, they studied under this guy named this neo-Kantian Cornelius. And the interpretations of the transcendental deduction are fairly critical. One, the schematism, it emphasized the schematism as this kind of rigid, reified structure, which is really the second transcendental deduction. The first one emphasizes the imagination, and Heidegger brings this stuff out. And and you go into Marcuse later in an essay on liberation, basically is incorporating that whole notion again. And I think it lays the groundwork later on for his aesthetics, which, as you said, he never really finished.
Right.
But I mean, Kant's not that, he's a pain in the butt to read. But when you get down to it, it's not that difficult to understand.
Right.
So-
When you say,
Patrick makes a good point, Carl. Let me just intervene for, make a remark here. Very important about the imagination here, right? That there's the productive imagination, right? That, working very actively here in terms of the schematism, and that Heidegger is one path of that. Very important path here of the imagination, right? So you have to think about that. What does cinema do too, right? Why do they choose, and there's that famous, and I think I've said this in some of the sessions, there's that famous quote in the Dialectic of Enlightenment that Hollywood has mastered the a priori of Kant. Very interesting the way this is said. This is said by Adorno and Horkheimer in the second chapter of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Now, I'll see if I think I have it somewhere. Maybe I can give you the page number. But anyway, they have mastered the a priori, right? So this is very important to keep in mind. How does this image production, this image thought in Deleuze's language, which is, again, another philosopher who's anti-Kant and, has much more to do with stream of consciousness, Bergson, right? That Deleuze takes up in cinema image, cinema time, right? These are the image movement and time movement, right? In Deleuze. So,
yeah,
so the two books that he writes on this. So this becomes, this is a very interesting discussion. But Patrick's absolutely right. Going back to Kant here is very important because of the schematism that develops out of it and the ways it goes, from the teacher Hans Cornelius on the one side and Husserl for Heidegger on the other, right? How these twains are, kind of at odds with each other at times, right?
And before I'll let you go, Carl, just 1 second here, in terms of, you mentioned the passage that the culture industry had mastered the notion of the a priori of Kant.
Yes.
There was an article which was submitted by a guy named Zohnrethel in the 30s to the Zeitschrift, basically about the whole notion of the a priori.
Yes.
So Ruther went on and wrote a fascinating book on intellectual manual labor. That's another story in itself. But there is this kind of connection. They're grappling with this idea.
Absolutely.
But anyway, go ahead, Carl. Sorry.
oh, it was just kind of again, we could come back to some of these things, but
No, it's good. Yeah, we will. Yeah.
the synthesis and the imagination. By the way, I really like Kant. I read him, a long time ago, but I think he's great.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's just,
I like Fritz, who got the fish for him.
I think Kant has one of the most wild intellects. I just think it's amazing, some of the stuff he does. But the way I always understood the schematism, and again, this is recalling from the past, is that my tertiary retention here is that the schematism is sort of the application of certain logical categories to space-time, right? And I'm not quite clear how imagination, like, where does the way I was taught that was not as prominent in the discussion of how to understand what Kant was doing. What does Kant mean by imagination, and how are you using that?
I feel like we would need to discuss the text, but in general, it's to use Heideggerian language, it's creating the field in which we can apprehend the world.
Right.
Okay.
And to that extent, it's how we can connect with being. But in Kant, and the way, I think probably the reason why he shifts from the first edition to the second edition is because there is an increased emphasis on the limitations of knowledge later on, whereas in the first transcendental deduction, there's much more of an openness in terms of trying to figure out how we make that connection with the world.
Mm-hmm.
But this is, I
Can I add one more thing to that, just really
Yeah,
briefly?
good.
I mean, I'm not authoritative at this, but I did my dissertation on Coleridge and Wordsworth, and Coleridge wrote a biography literaria where he tried to take Kant, basically plagiarized Kant, and one of the big passages is trying to take imagination, which is a romantic device. It's a romantic trope, which is quintessentially related to Romanticism. And he finds that within Kant's notion of the Einbildungskraft, the idea of unifying the image, which is really, I think, and this is where I think Kant and Heidegger really diverge, is Kant is not interested in being here. It's in the mental construct, right, of how the mind is able to image things. So that's about all I remember. So I'm going to stop before I make a fool
He's
of
still
myself.
a thinker of, you're right. I mean, a thinker of cognition. Yeah, important. Yeah. And Coleridge and Kubla Khan is really playing with the imagination of Kant too, right? I mean,
Yeah, no, stealing, basically trying to understand imagination as a philosophically grounded concept, which I think, is not really that important before. Thank you.
No, good. Yeah, we'll go back to this because I mean, cinema kind of shifts perception completely, right? But I mean, it's the mastery of the mental, the cognitive ability, and the receptivity, if you will, of these images that Adorno and Horkheimer are commenting when they talk about the a priori, how they've mastered this in Hollywood, right? Yeah, they don't go around saying, I got the critique of pure reason here, etc. But they're mastering something that Adorno and Kant can locate in the a priori in Kant, right? And this is how you get, multiple Batmans. This is how you get multiple Spider-Mans. This is how you get multiple Supermans. Planet of the Apes. How do you get this franchise culture in the thing, the blockbuster films? I mean, I think all these things are very important to understand, right? In terms of what they do, what they're capable of doing, meaning the producers and the directors or captains, as Stuart Ewan used to call the captains of consciousness, right? So this is very, very important here, I think, what we're doing and what Stiegler is up to in a way. I don't think he has a romantic notion of the imagination here. He's trying to think about, and in a way, what's been destroyed during this period to me is the imagination in the sense of the radical imagination, right? The imagination is used in terms of reduplication of everything around, right? Anything, the memes, right, etc. This is not a radical imagination at work. So yes, I mean, this is very, so that would be a good project, given what your questions were, Carl, and with Josh, extended on, how does this a priori change historically, right? In terms of that, now Josh for 60 seconds has a meme in front of him that gives him a method of distraction to work with. Yeah.
Well, but what just to clarify, what are you referring to by the a priori here? I mean, Kant has a very specific.
Well, experiential nature, right? Right. What is our pre-experience?
What are the categories by which we understand the world?
How do we understand the world? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I just add one more thing before we hang up? Really briefly, because this is an area that I'm interested in, this idea of the imaginary versus and involved in politics. There's a woman at the professor at the New School. I can't pronounce her name well. It's Chiara Bottici. She's kind of developed this idea of imaginal politics, and based on the Greek philosopher Castoriadis. And so there are a lot of this, I think, going on in contemporary life following Stiegler, where the image and the imaginary are being purposed. So I'm not sure how that ties in with Stiegler's work.
Cornelius Castoriadis is the architect of the term the radical imagination.
Right.
He's the architect of the term in the early 60s, right?
Yeah.
And he basically said, when he was asked about the revolution, it's going to take many years of study, right? He was asked about that. And he said, many years. And then May of 68 happened, right? And about 4 years later. But anyway, Castoriadis, The Imaginary Institution of Society is the big book, that, has
Yeah,
a
thank you.
density. Josh will show you a copy. It's probably on his desk.
And he was
Okay,
part of
there
the
you go.
group.
There's the Imaginary Institution of Society.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. When it comes to the Greeks, this group is on point sometimes. Yeah, but
Castoriadis, he was part of a left group with
socialism or barbarism.
socialism, barbarism, and the other people were Lefort, Claude Lefort was part of it.
Claude Lefort was part of that group. Jean-Francois Lyotard was a peripheral member.
Yeah.
Henri Lefebvre was very good friends with them, even though he wasn't a member of the group per se, because he was still a party member for part of that time. The party was still under somewhat the influence of Stalin in France. And quite a cast of characters.
When I saw him back in the early 70s speak, he was actually practicing as a psychoanalyst.
Yes. He's also a good mathematician, played the stock market well. Yeah. And he was like Khrushchev. He would bang his shoe he would remind you of Khrushchev. He was very, very dominant. He would bang the shoe on the table. So yeah. But he was one of the Greek exiles. There are many. I wrote about this a little bit, and I'm developing the second part of it right now on a kind of creative nostalgia, because I think they all participate in this. The Greek boat people, I called them Cornelius Castoriadis, Kostas Axelos, Kostas Papagiannou, Mimi Kronaiki, were all part of a group who ended up in Paris, who had to get out of town because they were going to be executed by the Greek government during the war. They left on Christmas Eve, 1944. And they ended up in Paris and all went on to pretty productive careers. Axelos became the editor of Editions Minuit. Papagiannou wrote many books on Marx and was a professor there. Castoriadis became Castoriadis, polymath. He was really a polymath in many ways, right? And Kronaiki wrote very good books on nostalgia and her husband was a leading Leibniz scholar, Belleville, Von Belleville in Paris. So it's a very interesting group how Castoriadis got here. Never had much of a presence in the United States either, but to the new school, yes. Yeah.
One other thing I just, to point out is that it does seem.
This is a very different approach, by the way. Stiegler is much more Derridian. And this is a Derridian, Simondonian, Leroy Gouranian, and in some ways an appropriation of Deleuze and Foucault. So I want to keep the differentiation alive. Yeah, I can do the French history, very easily. But yeah, it's very important. But I think Patrick framed it well. The struggle was really over the imagination. And I think Douglas adds to this in terms of the Romantic imagination and the period of German Romanticism and, of course, English Romanticism, too. What was the imagination about? Remember, Shelley is a translator of, the Symposium from ancient Greece. Lord Byron, who's the Goethe of England, so to speak, is also going back there. So you have all these things happening at the same time, And actually, I think De Quincey went to visit and wrote a beautiful text, The Last Days of Immanuel Kant, visiting with Kant on his deathbed. Yeah. So, Confessions of an Opium Eater.
Right.
Saved in Chelsea. I read that in Chelsea in England in his honor time at a coffee shop. We read it. Yeah.
I agree. Stiegler is a very different.
Yeah, it's very different. This is a struggle again over, if you will, over the imagination. What is the imaginary? The imaginary institution of society, the imaginary in Lacan and in Freud, of course, right? In a sense, how much of Kant is in Freud at this point? And does Lacan Hegelianize Freud to a degree, which was one of the charges, right? In terms of the the workings of the mind. So yeah, so these are very good questions, lifelong projects here.
But one of the things I think that seems important about what he's doing is his critique of Husserl, and that he sees Husserl as very much trying to separate imagination from perception, and I think he's trying to reintegrate that, right? That the primary retention, the just has been, in Husserl, and then there's recall in Husserl, and he makes this interesting argument that in fact the recall determines the nature of the primary retention, but also the protension. Right. So it seems like, and I just started the section on Kant, but it seems like he's basically trying to say Kant almost said the same thing. He just got confused.
He said that, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm kind of,
okay, good. This is what happens all that jail time. He used to practice protension, retention every day in the cell.
Right, exactly. But he
does mental exercises on a daily basis. The fixer, Malamud's character, is reading Spinoza. But anyway, Stiegler is reading and performing retention, So we'll go over this more technically. Look, at least we're acclimated a little bit to the language and, what some of the stakes are. Tonight, that was.
Well, it would be very interesting to see what, I'm very curious to see how he develops this so that it becomes so critical, right? I mean, why? Because he's spending a lot of time being very particular about differentiating these categories and concepts and how they articulate or don't. And I'm just very curious to see where this goes in terms of why this becomes so important to his argument. So,
well, maybe we can, maybe we can do two quotes that he begins the book. He's got great series of quotes. Epigraphs, right? The spectator's emotion and reason are rediscovered in the process, Eisenstein. But the best one's Hitchcock. I am a prisoner of commercial compromises. I wanted to make movies by abandoning myself to my ideas. But that would only be possible if a film came in at no more expense than a pen or a sheet of paper. What would happen if one gave a painter a brush, a blank canvas worth $1 million, a palette worth $250,000, $300,000 worth of brushes, $750,000 box of paints, and then told him to do whatever he wanted to according to his inspiration? But without forgetting that the finished painting would have to bring in 300 million, right?
That's great.
And the great thing to this was Louis Buñuel, when he did Los Olvidados, they asked him, how much is the film going to cost? And he said, about $250,000. They said, that's all? It can't be a good film. And Buñuel started laughing, so he went out and spent a little more and made, the great Los Olvidados, right? Yeah. This was his joke on Hollywood, in many ways. But these are great quotes here to think through what he's really trying to do here, through the artists themselves, in a way. As Freud used to say, lay down the arms in front of the poets, right? Yeah. So, I don't know what, look, the question is, he's trying to give us, again, a new place of orientation. Remember, the thinkers we're reading this semester are really, and Kittler is even more technical, right, in terms of the technical objects when we look at optical media. But remember, they're all trying in so many ways, in different ways, to really reorient, that they see us as so disoriented, right? So lost, so much product of the ennui and the malaise, to use Jasper's old famous saying, we're all shipwrecked in a certain way, so they're trying in many ways to build those new categories, if you will, and new concepts that at least give us some anchoring points to move out of this morass and this malaise. I mean, the question of malaise is the question here. It's how, cinematic time, is both contributing, but could be a way out of it too, right? And so, and this consciousness. And he has this group of films, of which Fellini is one. You know, he likes he likes many. Jean Vigo. He loves Rene. You know, Alain Rene. Yeah, I have a list of films he likes. I have a very big file on Bernard Stiegler, and yeah. Anyway, yeah.
You should
And,
post them so we can
Yeah,
basically.
I'll do that. I'll do that. I'll post them. Yeah, good point. Yeah. I'm looking for them right now. Yeah. And also, I went back and looked at this too. I pulled this. Luckily, I had it in New York. Kuleshov on the film, who was really the teacher of teachers. You know, he was the Kino man in the Soviet Union. Lev Kuleshov, right? This was Eisenstein's thinker, as teacher, as well as Vertov, etc. And he'll speak about the Kuleshov effect, right? Constantly, right? And we'll go over that. So I pulled this down, and his great book is called The Art of the Cinema, Kuleshov. This is the book I'm looking at right now, right? Okay, yeah. And he very much, yeah. He talked about film repertoire, you know, the art of the cinema. Yep. And you know, remember for Vertov, the camera itself is the fourth term of the dialectic, beyond thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That the camera is the fourth term in any movement, right? And yeah. So we can talk about that too. Yeah.
I wonder, this is just sort of babbling out loud, but I wonder if we could get some insight into derivatives, thinking of them as temporal objects. I've actually done, you know, some work in that area, and they're very hard to actually say anything interesting about.
I thought Selena Gomez did a great job in The Big Short, explaining them. Have you seen that movie?
Oh yeah, but that's just kind of like yeah, no, that's kind of just they're sort of like, you know, what you can say about them, but then when, you know, how they work and those types of
I mean,
things.
how they're mathematized and put into various
like
algorithms and then sold to black
Yeah.
whatever it is, and all these big hedge funds. And
in a certain way, it's hard to say, to come to the conclusion that they're anything other than just a gambling instrument. I mean, in some ways, that's really what they are.
and
And
you know, risk management is a nice way.
right, you know, and there's people but like in a certain way, I mean, there's, yeah, I know some, but there is something else that's happening in terms of the representation of the world to a derivative, how Wall Street is constructing time and the future and the past and conjoining them and separating them.
Sure.
That's kind of how you kind of get at that more almost philosophically.
David Bowie wrote a 100-year bond on his future earnings.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
So, you know, right there.
Yeah.
And that's why, what's her name? The model says she'll never marry another man again or whatever. Now that David's gone, never be interested in another man, right? So he figured out the derivative on his creative production, right? Anyway, yeah. But anyway, yeah, no, it's an interesting, I mean, it's how we live. I mean, this algorithmic governmentality is a very important part of our everyday lives that becomes, you know, the hidden moment in the culture, because these things are bundles. It's not only what the derivative is a derivative of, right? It's how it's mathematized and then bundled into a very complex series of relationships that are going on globally all the time. Yeah. Why?
Yeah.
And talk about nation states at war with each other. It's usually about trade and economic warfare, but ultimately, you know, the Chinese have the same notion of what the derivative is doing and own a lot of them, just like, you know, Wall Street. So, you know, it's not really so different in so many ways.
Right. And in some ways, you know, the mathematics, while it's very complicated, the mathematics that's used to create derivatives is in some sense the easier part to understand, in the sense that, you know, it's a set of techniques that you use to structure probabilities and then price them. And but the thing I'm saying is, it's more like, what's the semiotic of the derivative? What is it really representing? beyond sort of the agent's own self-understanding of what they're doing. It's
I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot, signs taken for wonders. We should
Yeah.
wonder more than just read the semiotics. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's Heidegger at work too with Aristotle. But,
So anyway,
yeah, it's a good program there. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, the mathematics is not hard to figure out. It's 17th century mathematics in many ways. It's probability theory, and it's working there. The real question is, yes, how these complicated bundles, start working. Why is it that a yield curve on the Treasury can set up, billions of dollars one way or another? What is being factored into that when the trading systems go into some kind of synthetic melody or whatever you want to call it? How is that orchestrated, right?
Yeah.
Because most of the trading is predetermined.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer individuals that just trade. I mean, you can make money if you're good. I mean, of course, if you read it well and et cetera. But most of the trading is 75% done by machine calculations,
Right.
algorithms, et cetera. So you
Yeah.
have this thing. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Douglas. Yeah. And maybe we can cut off your imagination derivatives and pick up with cinematic
There you go.
next week. Yeah.